Alrighty, welcome ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to be going through a webinar that I've decided to call Little Known Learning Modes. And that's because I really just couldn't think of a better thing to call it. But basically there's a group or a series of types of learning, I guess you would call it, learning strategies that don't really deserve a 40-minute, 1-hour lecture to themselves, but I think I should mention, and I think it's important to understand when you're using a particular learning style and when you're learning a different style and when you're transitioning from one to another, and to be able to also consider which one is the most appropriate type of learning style or learning mode, for your particular situation. So I think as one, it gives us options. I like to say that it adds tools to your tool belt so you can pull one out and use this one or pull one out and use this one. Because if you don't have those tools there or you're not aware that they exist, then you might not be able to make the best decision about how you go about developing a course or whatever. But also, a lot of these things we actually do as professional educators. We're out there in a classroom, usually in a classroom, and we do a bunch of this stuff. So to be able to put a name to it and a title to it and to be able to classify it as a mode of learning or a type of learning means that we're able to then look at it and study it and ask questions about it and think about the best practices around that particular mode. So let me just get started with the very top one, and that's called textbook learning. Now, textbook learning isn't an actual style of teaching or method of teaching or mode that you'll see if you Google it. I'm not going to say invented that particular mode, but I do have a section in my book where I talk about something that I call textbook learning. And the reason for that is because in the real world, in actual classrooms with real teachers and real teacher aides, there are a huge amount of people who use textbooks. Every single school, if you walk into your average English classroom in, say, Year 9, teachers are using textbooks. That's not to say every teacher does, it's not to say every classroom does, but textbook learning or using textbooks as a basis of being able to deliver a sequence of activities is very, very common. Now, of course, they don't teach this at uni because it's a part of the traditional approach and it's all, considered to be something that we've moved away from and all this kind of stuff. But I think there's a lot to be said about using textbooks, as bad as the general, reputation they might have, because they are written by experts most of the time. They do follow a logical sequence. They save us a ton of time, and a lot of them are actually really, really good. Now, if you go to your average maths class, say a Year 11 maths class or a Year 6 maths class or whatever, teachers are almost always using textbooks to some description. In fact, even if you go to university, ironically and strangely enough, they make you buy a bunch of textbooks to study teaching, but then they don't use textbook learning as an actual strategy to teach teachers to teach in classrooms, which I just find is really hypocritical and quite funny actually. But anyway, if you go into any classroom, almost any classroom, you will see textbooks of some description being used. Now, you've got to be careful in the way in which you choose those books. Quite often you'll just walk into a class and they'll already have them there because there are certain types of English books that most Year 9 teachers in certain countries will use, and they come in and out of fashion and so on and so forth. But if you work in a particular school, let's say you start working as a teacher aide or a teacher or whatever in a Year 7 class and you're teaching maths, you will already have access to a wide range of what they call class sets. And a class set will be a 25 or 30 not volume, but copies of a particular textbook. Now, you can also pick these up at the $2 stores, at the op shops and the second-hand shops and things if you're working in a class that doesn't follow or doesn't use the textbook learning process, I guess, but you still want to learn more about that particular topic. And I think they're a really good summary of all the different things that are recommended to be studied in that particular year or that particular level. Now, I'm thinking about English as a second language classes in particular. They use heaps of textbook learning because they'll follow one textbook for year 11 and one for year 12, one for year 8, one for year 9, and so on and so forth. Maths classes use textbooks to death. Lots of English classrooms do, science does, and so on and so forth. Now, anyway, I won't talk any more about textbook learning, except for the fact that I guess I'd like to just highlight the fact that for me personally, I think it is a strategy. It is a mode of learning, and we should therefore look at it and think, okay, what is best practice around basing a lesson or activity on using a textbook? How do we go about doing that? And I'm not going to answer that question today, but I do think, or one hint that I can give you is to think about all the other strategies and techniques and things that I talk about in my other books, in my other videos. So that's scaffolding, modelling, shared learning, the planning processes, and whole part whole learning, modelling. I recently did a lecture on a webinar on literacy and language. So that will have a lot of information in there about how you can use textbook learning. The last thing I will say, well, I guess you could naturally draw that link there because you're studying parts of texts in those language and literacy classes, and that's what textbooks do. They quite often lay out a series of scaffolded step-by-step ways to study a particular topic. Now, it doesn't mean you have to go through and learn one topic and then learn the next and then do number 3. Quite often teachers will do chapter 1, 2, 7, 6, 1, again, sometimes as a revision or whatever. So they're a little bit all over the place. You don't have to study them from start to finish, but they are used. They're used at university. They're used even for PhD students studying research, how to research and all this kind of stuff. They're used year 1s who are learning phonics and this kind of thing, or phonics and various different aspects of that phonological awareness type process and so on. So they're used throughout. Okay, next we have self-directed learning and independent learning. These should actually be around the wrong way. I just wrote these up as I guess they came to mind. And there is a slight difference, and I think you should consider these together, but also just note the difference, because if you're doing self-directed learning, but you're really intending that the student has, if you're doing self-directed learning, then that's one specific way of if you're intending on students to become self-directed learners so that they can do self-directed learning, that is very different to independent learning, quite different. So independent learning is where a student is still learning inside a classroom and they're learning under the scaffolds and structures of a teacher or teacher aide who designs sort of, I guess, the bubble that they're in. So they're still following a program of learning of sorts, even though they're learning on their own without the teacher helping them over the top of their shoulder, or the teacher aide or whatever. So they're learning on their own. So they're independently, so they might be in a classroom, the teacher might do something on the board and then say, now I want you to go off and learn about this thing or learn about that thing, and you've got 15 minutes and then you can share that information with me. So that's independent learning, and obviously there's various different ways you can do that. But you can see how that's different to self-directed learning, which is where there is no teacher involved. Well, there might be a teacher involved, but not to structure out the actual learning procedure or the sequence of learning. So, for example, if I decided that I wanted to go learn how to play golf, then I would be using some type of self-directed learning, because I might decide that, okay, I'm going to go watch a bunch of YouTube videos on it, and I'm going to read some blogs, and I'm going to go practice. And a part of that, there might be a teacher involved. I would probably need, well, I'd certainly need someone to actually show me the finer points of golf, because I don't know anything about golf. So they would be involved, but I'm directing my own learning. Whereas this one, you're not directing your own learning, you're actually just learning, but on your own for a short period of time, as it's being directed by the person who is controlling the sequence of learning, if that makes sense. So this happens in a classroom or homework and things like that. This is where no teacher, it's not a part of a formal program or course or anything like that. So there are slight different variations there. Now, the reason this is important is because we want students to become self-directed learners. And the reason we teach all these metacognitive skills and coping strategies and all that kind of stuff is because we want students to be able to do this on their own at home. A part of that is developing those independent learning skills and setting little independent learning tasks. But at the end of the day, you can't be there forever. You can't be there to help them if they want to learn how to, I don't know, if they're interested in computers and they want to start learning about computers on their own. You can't be there all weekend and every afternoon and all this kind of stuff. And eventually they're going to get to a point where they supersede our abilities anyway. So that's where we try to give, that's one reason why we try to give them as many self-directed learning skills as they possibly can. And that's things like whole part whole learning, self-questioning, reflective practice, scaffolding, summarising and synthesising, so on and so forth. There's lots of different, think about all those strategies that I talk about, and there's over 100 of them. Think about them and how you could teach those to students so they can become self-directed learners, so they direct their own sequences. Okay, so that's the first three there. No real relationship there and there. I mean, maybe, but not really. That's not the point of it. I didn't do these in any particular order, by the way. But those two, there is something of a, I guess, something of a relationship between those two in a sense that don't get them mixed up because they are slightly different. So the way in which, if you're trying to promote independent learning, you want students to become independent learners. That's different to self-directed learners, and we go about doing that in a slightly different way. It's almost like that one leads eventually to that, if that makes sense. Okay, so next one is flipped learning. You can see how flipped learning is actually related in a sense to these ones, only a little bit, but it is definitely related. Now, flipped learning is a new concept, I guess you could call it. It hasn't been around for that long, 20 years maybe, something like that. And basically, with the advent or invent of technology, what's happened is we've been able to change the way in which students go about studying and learning new things, because suddenly we've got this thing called a camera or even just a sound, but generally a camera. So when podcasts came around and the ability for teachers to do things like I'm doing now, make lectures and so on and so forth, record them, and then students could go off and learn and watch those lectures on their own. So that came about, or that brought about this thing called flipped learning. And the idea of flipped learning is traditionally in a class, students would go and they'd start off and they'd learn the basics with the teacher. They might read something or watch a little video on it or whatever. And they'd do all this basic stuff in a class for, say, the first half of the class. And the second half of that 1 hour lecture, maybe they would move on to doing some pair work or some more advanced type stuff and some more advanced, or I'd say some more difficult, challenging things that required the help of the teacher. But the problem with that, and then they would go home, the teacher would set homework at the end, right? And then they would go home and they'd do, say, half an hour of more challenging exercises to extend their learning or whatever. Now, there are some inherent and obvious problems with that structure when you think about it. For starters, a lot of that stuff that's real basic at the start is just a waste of time in the sense of why do it in class? Why not do that at home? And then when you're in class, you can spend more time with the teacher, who is an expert in teaching. So they're an expert in either pedagogical or andragogical techniques, as in how to teach, how to get information and concepts from the point of which the student doesn't have a clue to the point of which they are approaching near mastery as well. How do they go? That process is called teaching, and the teacher/teacher aide is an expert in that process. So not only that, but they're also a content expert. So they know how to spell, they know how to write a sentence, they know how to do maths, or they know how to, whatever subject it is, do science and do sciencey type stuff. So you've got a content expert and a teaching expert who knows these hundreds of teaching strategies. You want to really maximise those two skills. And if students are only there for an hour, why would you then get students to watch a video for 15 minutes and then listen to the teacher just talk for 15 minutes? Why not get them to do that at home the night before? Now that's called flip learning. And then what happens is during class, you come in, you do a quick little revision, a little consolidation type activity, and then you got 55 minutes where you can actually do the hardcore difficult stuff, the real challenging stuff where you need that teaching expertise and you need that content expert as well. So that's the whole idea around flip learning, is that we used to do basic stuff in class and the more advanced stuff at home. Let's flip that around, and now let's do the basic stuff outside of class the night before, say weekend before, and the really advanced stuff at home. Now you can go about doing that a lot of different ways, and a very simple way is, well, read this at home and then we'll go through it tomorrow type of thing. Or read this, go through all the basics and we'll go through it tomorrow. So setting homework in that reverse flipped way. It's also called inversed learning. Inversed? Haven't heard that term for a while. I think it's inversed, might be inverted. I'm not sure. Anyway, so I just call it flip learning. Now, let's move on from that one. You've also got, well, actually, just one last quick point on flip learning is, I actually love that as a concept because you can start thinking about the way in which you're planning out your programs, given the limited amount of time you have to deliver content. So if you've got students 4 hours per week times 10 weeks, right? Then you've actually got them for 40 hours, but in actual fact, 10% of that's going to be gone. So let's say you're down to 36 hours because you've got admin type stuff. That 10% disappears. In fact, probably about 30% disappears pretty quick. So you've got a 60-minute lesson, 6 minutes at the start to muck around, 6 minutes at the end, and 6 minutes in the middle. So you lose 30% real quick. So 30% of 40 is 12. So that leaves 28. So you've only got 28 hours left to deliver content. That's assuming there's no absences, that you're not away for anything as well, that and it doesn't take into account all the reviews and things like that you have to go through during that process, and the other interruptions, excursions and incursions and school assemblies and stuff like that. So you'd be lucky out of 40 hours if you actually did a good solid, that's a bit messy. If you did a good solid 20 hours worth of actual work. So that's in a whole term. That's 4 days a week for an hour. So that's a pretty, standard sort of time frame, I guess, for any middle school or whatnot. If they'd go to maths 4 times a week, they'd go to English 4 times a week, science 4 times a week, social science, whatever they call it, 4 times a week. They'll go to, plus they'll have their elective type things, and they'll have phys ed and so on and so forth. So they're doing all these different things. They're only doing it 20 hours a term, or 80 hours. Now you think most people, if you work full time, that's 2 weeks. That's about just over 2 weeks worth of work if you're working full time. So, it's not a huge amount of time that you've got. If you can maximise that time by adding an extra 10 or 15% to that, I mean, you would think that if students are scoring 60% and you could improve the learning time by a bit, then maybe that 60% could improve. I don't think the maths works out that logic wouldn't have it that 60, you improve it by 10, they get to 66% overall. But I mean, maybe it could be a little less, maybe it could be a little more, but it certainly couldn't help. So it's always worth thinking about flip learning in that sort of mathematical kind of way, but also in a very strategic kind of way, and how that can help students working towards their educational goals. So that's flip learning. If you're a teacher aide and you're working in classes, it's interesting to just be aware of that, because then you'll know when teachers are implementing it or when they're doing the old sort of, when I say the old, I mean the traditional way. Now, you've got incidental learning, which is a very simple one. That basically means that when things happen and you have the opportunity to teach kids something, or adults, even if it's not really related to what's going on or to the topic, usually it's better if it is, but sometimes it's not. It's just taking those opportunities to teach. So I think incidental is probably, I don't like the word incidental. I like to think of it as opportunistic. So if I could, I don't know who made that, but I would prefer if it was called opportunistic learning, because that's really what it is. So you might be, something political might happen, like an election or some type of world event, and so you might just have a chat about it for 2 minutes, or if you overheard students talking about it, you might say, did you know, or whatever. So that's incidental learning. Now, cross-curriculum learning, this is called a range of different things. Traditionally, I guess, it's just called cross-curriculum learning, but it could, I think, depending on where you are, it is called lots of different things. Cross-curriculum priorities is another one. Personally, I like to call them secondary priorities. Now, that's not because they're not important or anything like that, but I think that the key things that we teach kids, reading, writing, the literacy skills, which is different to reading and writing, their math skills and numeracy skills, which again, two different things, science, phys ed, so that people have those gross motor and fine motor skills. These are really important things. They are our priority skills in my personal view anyway. And I think cross-curriculum type things are things that come secondary. Important? Sure. Not saying they're not. But I think you can't engage in the world if you can't read and write. So I just like to call them secondary priorities. And when I'm planning things out, I always like to have my key things that I'm aiming for, or my primary priorities, I guess you call it, and the secondary priorities. So yeah, again, even I'm calling them a couple of different things. But point is, if you are planning out and you're looking at how you structure out, say, a unit of work, which is between 3 to 6 weeks worth of work for in a primary school class that covers math, science, English and whatever, then within that you'll have secondary priorities or cross-curriculum priorities. And what they basically are is the links, the generic, not generic, but the links between those different things. Now that can be, for example, sustainability or cultural studies or whatever. So sometimes it can be IT, sometimes it can be more genre specific. But generally speaking, these are the type of activities or the type of learnings that a teacher or group of teachers will emphasise that cross multiple subjects. So that's called cross-curricular learning. We're going to do a lot of that anyway, like literacy, reading, writing. They're effectively cross-curriculum learning. But generally, and why I don't really like that term necessarily, and I like to talk in terms of priorities, because I think SMART goals will teach us, I won't write on the board, I always scribble all over the board, so I'm trying really hard not to. SMART goals teach us that the more specific and the more specific we can be, the more attainable those goals are. So I like the idea of, anyway, I won't talk any more about that now, but except to say cross-curriculum goals, again, or cross-curriculum priorities or secondary priorities, whatever you want to call them, they are things that, or learning goals that are generally secondary to the main learning goals. So, but they can cross teachers as well as cross subjects. So you could have, say, a year 9 environment where you've got a maths teacher, an English teacher, and say a phys ed teacher, and they all get together and they teach the same thing, which might be, say, or teach with the same topic. So that topic might be the Olympics, and they do their maths based on that sort of idea of the Olympics, and they talk about that. And then in the English class, again, they're using texts that relate to the Olympics. And then the sports class, I mean, obviously you could do Olympic game types of activities and stuff like that. So there's that link between the three, whether it's from that crosses different topics. So that's what cross-curriculum learning and priorities is all about. Sometimes the government set those, and then other times teachers get together in little groups and do it. It's a hell of a lot of work. Most teachers do it once and then never do it again. But you can also link it if you're a primary school teacher and you're teaching math, science and English or whatever. You can link those three together in a unit of work, which is what a lot of primary school teachers do anyway. Now, you've also got microlearning. Microlearnings mainly come from the adult sector, and particularly that human resource type area. Not so much adult, I guess, not the accredited type adult learning area or training area or the university sector or anything like that. Mainly from, I guess, the HR sector. So what microlearning is still evolving as a term. It's a relatively new term, but what it basically means, well, let me give you an example of it. I was talking to a person who worked at a bank the other day, and they were saying that about once a month they're required to log into their portal and watch some videos and do some little interactive stuff and answer a few questions about once a month, and it takes them half an hour. So that's an example of microlearning. It's a way to have people who are in the real world, in a workplace, to be able, so outside of a school environment is what I was trying to say, who are not enrolled in any type of formal training, and they're busy people. People are And you naturally would be, because if you're not busy, you're probably not going to have a job, because then there's no work available for you. So people are busy. Employers don't have time to let people go and do courses once a week for a day. That costs money because you still got to pay those wages, but also because it interrupts the business and the way they can service customers and stuff like that. So microlearning is a way of just doing little bits of learning here and there, highly targeted learning and specifically related to the job that person is doing. So that's called microlearning. And it can involve things like games and various different, all that fun stuff. But quite often what it actually is watching a little video or reading a few things and then answering some multiple choice questions about it. Sometimes they like to make it interactive, and you can join this word up to this sentence and click on this picture to see what this person thinks about this and to read this scenario or whatever. So, but anyway, if you just thought as a general concept, half an hour a month or something like that is a good definition of microlearning. That may or may not apply to you unless you're working in the adult sector. There's a new thing popping up these days called micro-credentials as well, which is, again, I've only started hearing that the last year or so. Micro-credentials is sort of like micro-learning, but in more of an official capacity where accredited institutions issue certificates of some description. I mean, because you can issue your own certificates if you're doing training with people, but it's different if there is some level of accreditation around that. So people can continually, that's one of the problems with most of the adult training environments, is that to improve in anything, you either do a PD, in which case you just get this, not fake, but you just get a certificate made by the lecturer or whoever did it, or you can actually do a full-blown course, in which case you get an accredited qualification and proper government sort of backed certificate or whatever. But there's nothing in the middle there that you can use to show that you've done a small aspect of that big course, unless you enroll. You can enroll in individual units and things. Microlearning is either that unit level or slightly below that. Okay, anyway, so just keep your eyes out open for that. Keep your eyes open and ears out for that. So we'll move on real quick. Now these ones are real slightly different compared to these ones, particularly these first three, because they do involve working with a lot of technology. Now, I've written technology learning there. Well, I've written tech learning, but technology learning, which is all about working with technology. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this one because it's very obvious, but basically tech learning is about using technologies to be able to help you learn. Now, if you walk into some primary school classrooms these days, a lot of them are just full of technologies. There are interactive whiteboards and so much different stuff happening. So a lot of teachers are really adopting and adapting the use of technology. That can include online learning and research and things, but doesn't necessarily have to. It can include games. It can include, you've got your board here and students come up and they grab that letter and they add it to that letter and they're doing phonics type stuff and things. So there's millions of different technology based things you can do. And again, if you are using tech learning, which basically means that technology is involved to a large extent, a lot of special needs centres and education support centres and places like that are using a lot of iPads and things these days as well. If you are using technology learning, then just making sure that you're thinking about, well, what is best practice here? How does what we know about all these strategies and techniques like scaffolding, modelling, guided learning, whole part whole learning, spaced learning, consolidations, reviews, the planning process for activities and stuff. What is the best way to plan out activities to make sure that we're getting the most out of tech learning and doing it properly? Chucking kids on an iPad, getting them to play a game, is that best practice? Okay. And I'm not saying it's not, but we should just be cognizant of the fact that a lot of the old school non-technology based strategies still apply when we are using technology. So anyway, that's online learning. That's So online learning is basically learning using technology. Obviously, it's a subset of it, I guess, but you're specifically using the internet to learn in some way, or students are learning in some way. The first thing and most obvious thing that comes to mind is research. I don't like to use the word research. I think students are retrieving information from various different sources. So that's basically online learning. They can go and play games and do various different short courses and things like that. But anytime you're using the internet, that is known as online learning. Now, again, just be careful, and I used to do this. You put kids on a computer, you say research something, and you sort of let them do their own thing, and it's just a way of entertaining them for a while. As you get more experienced and you learn more about strategies and things, you realise that that's bad practice. Unless you're teaching adults, maybe you can send them home and it's a part of a flipped learning thing. But if you've got kids in a classroom and you're entertaining them effectively, it's kind of more of a time waster than it is anything else. I'm not saying you can't do that, but you shouldn't necessarily be doing it every single day, because that's what I like. I like to call it the set and circulate strategy, and it's the reason I've sort of, I guess, coined that is because I see it regularly and I used to do it, and I think it's bad practice. And what that basically means is you set some work and then maybe explain it, and then you just circulate for the rest of the lesson. I don't think that's good teaching practice. I don't think it's teaching. Anyway, unless of course the exception being that you're doing independent learning. But then if you're doing independent learning and trying to get students to become self-directed learners, I don't think you should use that as a buzzword. I think you should really just you should actually be honestly thinking about what type of skills goes behind that. Are you teaching metacognitive skills, for example, as a part of that? And then there's feedback processes that need to happen there as well to develop those self-directed learning skills later on. Anyway, work-based learning, obviously with year 10s, 11s and 12s and people who are working in or training in the adult sector. Work-based learning is about learning in the workplace, having a mentor, and so on and so forth. Again, thinking about what is best practice? What is best practice as far as learning from a more experienced person and being able to apply things that you've learnt in the theoretical part of your course and so on and so forth. So it's important to think about spaced learning and the acquisition of skills over time and things like that. Whole part whole learning is another strategy that's really important to work-based learning. So these, by the way, I've actually got a lot of other videos, if you've seen some of my other ones, about different types of learning modes that I haven't written here. These are just the ones that I didn't feel like I needed to do an entire video on. But you might have seen my other videos on spaced learning, mass practice, whole part whole learning, and so on and so forth. I've got quite a lot of those, but anyway. So that's work-based learning. Contextual learning is very similar to work-based learning. In fact, almost the same. But this is one where you're trying to really contextualize the learning of students, or the environment in which they're learning in and what they're learning about to their larger existence, to their larger existence, I guess, to their larger life, to the environment in which they live in outside of the school environment. So the example I always use is if you're teaching in a farming community, then that's where that you could bring that type of information into the school environment. And there's two ways to do that. One is you're getting out of the classroom and learning in the field, but also the other way around, you're bringing the field into the classroom. So that's known generally as contextual learning. It can be a part of a work-based learning type thing, and particularly in terms of voluntary work and whatnot, but it is a separate type of learning. Then you've got immersion learning, which is relatively well known, been around forever. Immersion learning basically means that you're learning in an environment where you are completely surrounded by the content that you were trying to learn and acquire. So it's almost always, or almost pretty much only thought of in terms of learning a second language. So when babies and toddlers are basically going through immersion, so it just means exposure, just constantly being exposed to language. But when we talk about immersion learning, that means students are going into, say, a French class, and everything around the walls is just surrounded by surrounds those learners with words and phrases and cultural bits of information and visual cues and things like that. So and generally in that class it'll be as much, in that case, French as possible, so very little English. And over time, the teacher will be requiring students to talk to each other in French, and she or he will only talk in French, and so on and so forth. So obviously you can't do that on day one, but the more of it you do, the better. And the whole point of immersion learning is that obviously you just get multiple exposures, and that pure repetition helps people take that information from short term to long term. And obviously the more voluminous your exposure to something, the more of a chance that you're going to learn it and remember it in the long term. And this has really come from this idea that if you go live in France and you're living with a family or whoever who only speaks French and they won't speak English to you, and then you're going to school or work and just all in French, all you ever see is French or hear is French, you're going to pick up French really quick, and in a few months you'll be well on your way to being fluent. Yet we can put kids into high school, and by the time they finish year 12, like, they're still kind of fluent. They're only partially on their way to being fluent. So after a couple of months, you start getting really, I wouldn't say close to being fluent, but you're certainly well on your way. So that's because of that immersion. Constantly there, your brain just switches off one language and almost turns on another. And you're seeing signs, street signs, you're seeing adverts, TV, all that kind of stuff. So you've got that constant exposure as well, and you're seeing it in context, in real context, in authentic texts. Being forced to practice it is another aspect of immersion learning. So I just wanted to cover those 12 things, or whatever it is, 13 things, just so that you've got an idea about them. I don't think you should study each of them individually and spend hours looking into any different one. I just think it's important to be able to identify clearly what you're doing in the classroom or outside of the classroom or whenever you're teaching someone, so that you can then think about what best practice looks like. What does flipped learning look like? What does homework look like? What does best practice homework? So those are those tough questions to ask yourself. Why am I doing it this way? Why am I doing it that way? Is it because that's what's always been done? Is it because that's what parents expect, that's what kids expect, that's what the principal expects? Is that because that's what this teacher does, so therefore I'm going to do it? Is that what this teacher aide does, therefore I'm going to do it? Or are there other ways that we can help students achieve their goals, their learning goals? Are there other ways that might be better? So that is my webinar and my take on little known learning modes. Thank you for watching.